welcome to today's webinar, TRC Call to Action number 92, Youth Employment in Winnipeg. My name is Natasha Pei. I'm a community animator for Vibrant Communities Canada, and I'm here today for a special broadcast with three Vibrant Communities Cities Reducing Poverty members. We have Pam Svensson, Erica Weave, and Lee Stevens. And so before we jump into the introductions, I'd like to remind anyone who's not a regular member of our community of practice call Poverty Reduction from a First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Worldview, that today's webinar will provide an overview of the initiative, TRC 92 Youth Employment, and that we'll be having a deeper dive conversation around engagement and challenges on October 24th with the regular COP group. So we'd welcome others who are here today who are working on similar poverty reduction well-being initiatives with Indigenous populations to join us next week. And you can go further with our presenters in this area of practice. If you're not part of the Poverty Reduction from a First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Worldview group, the links to RSVP for this month's call, as well as the link to sign up for the group, will be provided in the follow-up email. And so to start with introductions, Pam, Erica, and Lee. Lee Stevens is our chairperson for the Poverty Reduction from a First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Worldview COP, and she's joined us here today to moderate the webinar discussion. Lee works at Vibrant Communities Calgary, staff team as the Community and Engagement Specialist. She is a member of the Tlingit First Nation, Deishitan Split Tail Beaver Clan, and grew up in Turner Valley. Lee has her master's in social work and has, for the past 11 years, worked as both a program manager and frontline worker with Calgarians living in poverty. During the past 2 years, Lee has focused her research and learnings on exploring some of the root causes of poverty, such as access to income support and increasingly precarious nature of employment, and for Indigenous people living in poverty, addressing the calls to action outlined in the Truth and Reconciliation Report, as well as critical and Indigenous evaluation methods. Lee believes that we have enough for all, meaning we have the resources not only to address the symptoms of poverty, but to actually reduce it. And Lee is joining me today in welcoming Pam and Erica. Pam Svensson is the director of the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council. Prior to joining the United Way of Winnipeg and the WPRC in 2015, Pam served in a number of senior management positions at the City of Winnipeg. She has extensive experience in leading diverse teams through innovative and inclusive strategic planning processes. And Erica Weave is the United Way of Winnipeg's Collective Impact Facilitator. Prior to joining the United Way, Erica spent 27 years working as a community development worker, both in the community and as part of the Government of Manitoba team. Over the years, Erica has worked with a diverse and extensive range of community leaders and has gained valuable experience bringing people together to tackle complex problems. So welcome, Pam, Erica, and Lee, and thank you very much for joining us on today's broadcast. Lee, I will turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Natasha. Glad to be here today to share some of our community of practice discussions more broadly with the Learning Network. So we're going to start with Winnipeg's collective impact story. Myself, I'm looking forward to learning more about what Winnipeg is doing in terms of poverty reduction as it pertains to Indigenous people using a framework of the TRC calls to action. So before we jump into the story of the TRC 92 Youth Employment Project, Pam and Erica, maybe you can just give us a broad overview of the Poverty Reduction Council and how you guys narrowed down your focus to, Indigenous people, Indigenous youth, and employment.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody, and thanks for giving us this opportunity today. Just very briefly, what the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council is, an initiative of United Way Winnipeg. The council itself has been around since about 2007, and it is a multi-sectoral table of right now 39 leaders from across our city. And the leaders are intentionally representing multiple sectors in our community. So business, government, all those things you see listed there on, or sectors you see listed there on the slide. And our intent is that as time goes on, we are working to make sure that the council continues to be as representative as we can of all the many different facets and the unique areas of our community. The council its mission is to work together to address the underlying causes of poverty. And a number of years ago, they developed or they adopted a collective impact approach to doing the work that they do. If you can go to the next slide, this slide here is intended to represent Council's framework for action, or their strategic plan. And I hope it's something that you can read. But if not, what it's intended to represent is each of those bubbles is one of the 10 aspirations that Council has identified as a key aspiration for their framework for action. And the idea with all the arrows is that all of these aspirations, whether it's starting strong, feeding ourselves, independence through income, each of them is interrelated and thought to have a significant impact on the other. A number of years ago, the Council decided, I say a number of years ago, 2 years ago, the Council had been working on the aspiration of homelessness, and out of the work of the Council came Winnipeg's 10-year plan to end homelessness. With that in place, and a new entity called End Homelessness Winnipeg established to implement that 10-year plan, Council decided to look at what was its next focus or priority aspiration. And what it decided on was that red bubble there, that achieving independence through income, thinking that that aspiration could likely have a great impact on many of the other 9 aspirations in their framework. So that's how they got to achieving independence through income. But then they had to go to the community and test it. So Erica can tell you more about that.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, so once we had landed on independence through income, and it was really because we saw it as having a cascading effect. I guess Mark Holmgren has talked about game changers, so it's very much that kind of thing, looking at which of those aspirations can impact the most other things or have a cascading effect. So once we had landed on that, we launched a intensive consultation process, first sort of with a general focus. So we met with as many key sectors in the community as we could, including Indigenous leaders, community renewal corporations, policy and planning and research groups, newcomers, Family Resource Center directors, sort of to ask the question, if we're looking at income as it relates to poverty reduction, what kind of focus areas are most important or would make the most sense? And at the same time, we were also doing a lot of literature reviews and really taking a hard look at the demographics in Winnipeg. One of the things that we heard in those general consultations is if you're going to look at income, then you have to focus on one or more of the following population groups: newcomers, women, youth, or Indigenous people. And so with that in mind, we did this demographic kind of research, literature review, and from that we landed on employment through an Indigenous lens, because as you may be aware, in Winnipeg, we have a very, very high Indigenous population and growing extremely rapidly and also very young. The median age of the Indigenous population in Winnipeg is 26 as compared to about 39 for the rest of us. And also, of course, very high unemployment rates within that population. So those were all the things we kind of considered as we went along. Once we decided on youth employment through an Indigenous lens, we went back and did more consultations, talking to anybody and everybody who was interested in Indigenous youth employment. And from that, some pretty clear gaps emerged. So at this point, we were asking, what's already going on? Where are the gaps? And within the WPRC mandate, the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council, what kind of actions would make the most sense or would be helpful? And we were able to unearth some significant gap. Businesses on the one side were saying to us, wow, we recognize these demographics. We recognize that something needs to be done. We want to play a part in that. We want to have a role in that, but we don't know how to access. We don't know where to start. We don't know how to do it right. We don't know how to access the youth. On the other side, we were talking to a lot of community organizations who were working on training Indigenous youth for jobs. And we have quite a few of them in Winnipeg. who are doing it in one way or another. They were saying to us, we have a lot of problems placing our youth in jobs once they're finished with our training. So there was a clear gap right there, and we thought maybe that's the place where we could play a part. We also made a deliberate effort to engage with Indigenous youth. We targeted organizations that were already working with youth, and we said, hey, is it okay with you if we come and chat with some of your participants? We had, I think, 4 meetings, and those were very interesting to us. So we just basically asked, what are your hopes and dreams as far as employment? And what we learned was that the main theme was that Indigenous youth have a lot of hopes and aspirations for having good, secure jobs that can provide some reliability and some stability for themselves and their families, and ultimately their communities. A lot of them were interested in, you know, social work and that kind of thing, some way to give back to the community. We want to keep connecting with those groups as we go along. At the same time, in 2015, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was coming out with its final report, which contains 94 calls to action. So we noticed call to action number 92, which is directly focused on business and reconciliation. In particular, it calls upon the corporate sector to ensure that Aboriginal people have equitable access to jobs, training, education opportunities in the corporate sector, and to provide education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, which will also require skills-based training and intercultural competencies, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So, with all those consultations and with what we were seeing in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we came up with a strategy, or with an initiative, and we were calling it TRC 92 Youth Employment, because we are really seeing the 90-second call to action as the grounding for everything that we're doing here. So we developed 3 strategies. The first is to raise awareness among employers in particular, but also more generally in the broader community about Indigenous history and current realities. The second strategy, again, guided by the 90-second call to action, is that we would support workplace education. So not just the employers, but the workers within those workplaces, about Indigenous history and intercultural safety. And then the final strategy would be to ultimately connect private sector businesses with the youth and with the trainers that we have been connecting with, the community-based trainers and the youth, for workplace experience and hopefully also jobs.
Erica, can you just leave that slide up? Oh, sorry. I'm going to interrupt you quickly because I just have a couple of comments I want and some questions. I find it interesting that you've narrowed your focus of poverty reduction, because here in Calgary, you know, we do all those things, you know, all those bubbles that you had, you know, we're attempting to do all of them, whereas you have really narrowed your focus to income and the impacts that an increase in income could have. So I think that's really interesting. I also have a question. When you did your consultations with the organizations that work with Indigenous youth and that train them, were some of those organizations led by Indigenous people, or could you maybe describe in detail who were some of those organizations that you worked with?
Sure. First of all, on the first point, yeah, we recognize it as sort of a different approach to just take one of those focus areas. I think there's probably pros and cons both ways. To doing it both ways, but yeah, the organizations that we connected with, most of them are Indigenous led. There's Gani Ganichik.
Oh wow.
Yeah, that works with Indigenous women mostly, and providing just a range of supports and also training that they do. They have a connection, in fact, with Red River Community College, where they do train their participants in administrative support. Another one is the Mama Wichita Center, which is based in the north end of Winnipeg, and which just is sort of, it's a very big organization which serves a lot of families in the north end. We have Build, which is a social enterprise which works with mostly with youth who have previous prison or gang experience and trains them for jobs in the construction trades.
Oh, wow.
WASAC, which is an acronym for Winnipeg Aboriginal Sports Achievement Center. So, but they also do a lot of training of their youth for jobs. We have CARD also, which is, what does it stand for again, Pam? CARD.
It's the Council for Human Resource.
That's it.
Yeah, Aboriginal Development. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So. And then there's, so those are all on an Urban Circle, which is also an Indigenous, it's not an Indigenous organization in the true sense of the word, but most of the people that work there are Indigenous. Then we have a couple, Momentum and Spencer Neighborhood Association, which are not specifically Indigenous organizations, but work with a lot of Indigenous people. So yeah, I think, yeah.
And then one last question. When you did your consultation with the Indigenous youth themselves, you described how you asked them about their dreams and their aspirations. But did they identify some of their own barriers to employment? Was there any conversation about some of their experiences trying to get jobs and things like that?
Yeah, we asked them for sure about that. You know, we found it interesting that they weren't very talkative about that aspect of it, but a few something, yeah. In fact, one story sticks out in my mind. There was one young woman who said, she was talking about Tim Hortons, and she said, forget it, I would never work there because it's just too hard to be the only Indigenous person. So that was one thing, yeah. They did talk a lot about that when we asked them what kind of a workplace they would hope for.
Yeah.
They talked about, you know, just wanting a family atmosphere where they felt comfortable and supported. So they talked about it in general terms in that way. Yeah.
Interesting.
But we know, also just one final point, we know from our research too that there is, you know, that there's no doubt there is racism is very clearly in a lot of workplaces. So that's a reality that we need to look at.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Thanks, Erica. We'll let you finish up the presentation.
Okay. So we developed this theory of change, and again, you're not going to be able to read this. Apologies for that, but maybe it at least gives you a sense of what the pathway that we sort of have in mind that we think is the way that things are going to proceed. So starting at the bottom, where we've indicated some of the demographic, the stats, and then on the left side in the green bubble, we have those community organizations that we've been mentioning. They're already doing this work of preparing their youth for pre-employment training, and where they can, giving them the work experience. Those are the two blue bubbles. And then on the right side, we have private sector employers. And really, this side is where we're concentrating most of our efforts right now. And we think that, you know, that's also guided by the 90-second call to action. But that's really where the work has to happen. And in fact, at this stage at least, and in fact, when we've consulted with some of our Indigenous partners, they're saying to us, oh, I'm so glad that you're not, you know, you're not focusing on the youth that have to change or have to improve or have to excel. We're focusing on this other side that has to do the work this time. So, so on the right side, private sector employers, and the first bubble is all about that employer learning about Indigenous history and current realities. Strategy number 2, the next bubble, is the workplace education that needs to take place with the employees. And then in the end, the big blue bubble, hopefully we're going to connect the two. We're going to try it out. So in social innovation language, we see this as really our prototype. This is what we're trying out with those arrows in the circle up there. That's, learn, revise, evaluate continuously. We're operating very much on a developmental evaluation kind of a model where we're learning as we go. And then in the end, at the top there, we hope to be able to use our learning to scale up, out, and deep is the idea. So we started with this theory of change, but one of the things we heard immediately when we were shopping it around is that looks pretty simplistic. It's not really that straightforward. It's much more complex. So we revised it and developed this one instead. Whoops, sorry. So this one reflects some of those barriers that you were talking about, Lee, in the red.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, we know that those are going to come into play. And also the green circles with question marks in the middle, that's sort of the systems that we think we're going to bring in to help solve some of those barriers, some of those systemic barriers, whether that's childcare, transportation, housing, you name it. So we think that this depicts it a little bit more realistically. And then the orange circles in the middle, those are, the little circles are the circles of knowledge. So those are all the groups that we want to, that are playing an important role in this whole initiative, and whether they're government or education or, you know, Indigenous leaders. That's sort of our round table of expertise that we plan to draw on throughout the initiative. So that's sort of our theory of change, our depiction of how we think things are going to unfold. Do I keep going?
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'll interject with another comment here. I like what you said about how the focus isn't on the youth themselves. One issue that I have with some poverty reduction strategies is it's a special attention to the people living in poverty, and it's reforming them and it's retraining them. When we know that poverty has very little to do with the people living in poverty and more to do with the systems that create poverty. So I really like this focus on the corporate sector and educating those employers about the reality of Indigenous people and the history and the truth of what happened in the residential schools. That's the systems change that needs to happen. So I'm just curious about how you went about doing that, because it's easier said than done. So I don't know how far along you are in that process, but I'm just curious to know how you approach that.
Yeah, we can tell you, and Pam is going to talk about that in just a couple slides. We're just starting down that road, so Pam.
Okay.
But yeah, we also think that that is what that 90-second call to action is calling us to do. It's really more focused on us than Indigenous people. We're the ones taking the action. Yeah. So one of the first things we did was we started to go out and talk to these community-based groups that are training youth. And this is a picture of two participants at BUILD. That's the social enterprise that I was mentioning early. And at this point, we said to them, listen, this is what we plan to do. Are you interested in being a partner in this? And so 8 of them have signed on as saying that they are interested in partnering with us. And what that will mean is that once we're ready for it, they will work with the employers and us. We'll do the convening, but they'll work with the employers to set up situations that are going to work for their youth within those workplaces. And I think Pam's going to take it from here.
So thank you for asking about how we approach this, because we're really excited about this part, and we're just right at the beginning stages. One of the really key things about our Poverty Reduction Council overall is that we have co-chairs, and we've always had a co-chair from business and a co-chair from community. So as we embark on this work with primarily with the employer sector for this stage of the initiative, it's been really fortunate that we have a co-chair, who a fellow named Dave Angus, who was former head of the Chamber of Commerce here in Winnipeg. He has recently left the Chamber of Commerce to move on to a job with Johnston Group, which you'll see Johnston Group's at the top of this slide. And so as we tried to figure out how do we move forward, one of Dave's thoughts that was really welcomed by the rest of the council is that perhaps what we do is we try to put together an employer consortium. We approach employers that are interested in learning more about truth and reconciliation, are open to going down a journey, a learning journey together. And so Dave, in his new capacity as a senior leader at Johnston Group, reached out to his many networks, and some of his colleagues assisted him with that as well. And in the spring of this year, so in June of 2017, we were able to bring together, at that point it was 9 private sector businesses who wanted to come together and meet to talk about what we were proposing in terms of that theory of change and how they might undertake a journey of truth and reconciliation in their organizations. So we were really excited about that. We were 9 people at that time, and really that first meeting was just a chance to get together to talk about how they might move forward, where they were at, and it became very clear from the first discussions that organizations are at very different stages of having a strategic Indigenous HR strategy. Some not really anything at all, and others are or have taken significant steps along this path. The group said at that point they were very interested in moving forward. Everybody signed on, and they were committed to meeting regularly and deciding on how to move forward. But it was the group that identified, and these were, when I say the group, it was mainly HR leads from these companies that came together for that first meeting. Our thinking was that if you're going to look at a human resource strategy and you're going to look at having an impact or affecting change and some of the status quo or the HR practices that are in place, you really need to start with the HR leads. So that's who came to that initial meeting. And what they said to us is before they moved forward, they really needed to undertake a learning journey themselves, that they didn't feel equipped in terms of having an understanding of the TRC commission work or the calls to action. So we said, we can help you with that. As WPRC, the council, we see ourselves as a convener, and we have this opportunity to bring together sectors and individuals that wouldn't normally be at the same table. So we reached out to Rai Moran, who many of you will know is the director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is based at the University of Manitoba here in Winnipeg. And Rai enthusiastically responded. We were so thrilled, and said he would be more than willing to meet with this group. So the group met again in August, and normally in Winnipeg, I don't know if it's the same where everybody is, but in Winnipeg things kind of shut down in the summer because our summers are so short, and so we're really reluctant to be asking people to meet in summertime. But it was the group that said, no, we want to meet, we're anxious to keep going, we want to get on this path. So they met in August, and Rai came and met with them in what was intended to be an hour presentation with some questions and answers. And he's such an incredible speaker, and the story that he had to share was so compelling and so inspiring that we were 2 hours and we were running out of time. So at the conclusion of that second meeting, the HR leads from these companies said, what we really feel like we need to do is now bring this to our CEOs and our senior leaders. If this is going to take hold, or we're going to go down this pathway in our companies, we really need to look at it, not just from a business perspective, but having our CEOs on board. So that's what we're doing now. Rai is coming back to meet with a group of CEOs from these companies. We're now up to 12 companies, and not because we've reached out, but because they're coming to us, saying they want to be a part of it. And we don't know. We don't want to say no to anybody. We don't know what the right number of companies is, so we're just sort of seeing how this feels, and we're ready to take that next step. So Eric, I think there's the next slide talks a little bit about where we're at and some of the conditions. The conversation we've had at the first 2 meetings includes some of what we see or we understand to be the components of success for a journey like this. And this is based on the consultations that Erica told you about, some of the conversations we've had with employers at the table that are partway along this path, but most definitely from youth and from the organizations that are supporting them in their training. So we've heard that it's important that employers understand the historic context and current reality of the Indigenous experience, that employers need to champion the initiative through the workplace, and that it has to come from the top, therefore the CEOs needing to be invested. That the long-term post-employment support, and this is what seems to be setting what we're trying or what we're looking at in this initiative apart from other things, that it's not merely a matching of what do employers need who wants to be employed and matching them up together. What we've heard in that is that often isn't successful because it's still using long-standing HR practices that are maybe just don't fit with the needs of a population that, you know, and one of the examples that keeps coming up in the bereavement leave that's typically in place in many companies is a couple of days. And often in a province like Manitoba, if for an Indigenous family, if there's a death in the family or something, where the family needs to travel up north and be away for a period of time, that just doesn't fit with HR practices. So what's typically happened is that employees will leave and retention becomes a problem. So definitely long-term post-employment support, and that could look like mentors in the workplace, support for childcare and transportation, or perhaps needed work equipment. Definitely culturally sensitive human resource practices, and staff training on intercultural safety, which is why we have the strategies laid out the way we do. And some of the principles that we're using at this point, and really we've got organically in there. This initiative really is happening organically, where we've got our theory of change as our proposed path, but we had no idea that it would take the time that it's taken. You know, we started a year ago looking to engage employers, and there was certainly been ups and downs where we thought, are we on the right path or not? And now we really feel like we are, but it really does take time to build those relationships and to support or facilitate that understanding. So this has been step-by-step, organic, iterative. We're really learning as we go and using a developmental evaluation approach, as Erica talked about. We think that the next step for the consortium are going to involve some learning sessions. And so we've actually got one happening tomorrow night. We have Carol Ann Hilton coming in. Carol Ann's from Simon Fraser University, and she's coming in to speak to a group because she's here for a session on Friday, so we piggybacked on that. And we think if we can provide, in addition to the employer consortium having their meetings, if we can provide some learning sessions and open them up to the broader community, that might be a positive step as well. We're continuing to consult with whoever will talk to us, and we think that the consortium, a big role for them is going to be the business-to-business learning and co-creation. If we can create an environment where they can share their lessons learned in a safe and supportive environment, that could be a good thing. And
wow.
Oh, that's a lot. We can ramble on.
Maybe like one more minute.
Okay, we're wrapping up.
Yeah.
I guess.
Okay.
Oh, should I proceed?
Yep.
Yeah, we just have another minute, and then I'm going to summarize and move us on to question and answering.
Sounds good. So what we've learned so far, first of all, about taking the time to do that preliminary research and the broad-based consultation is really important for building relationships and also making the case. Like, I really think the demographics on Indigenous population was one of the key things that eventually made the employers sit up and say, whoa, you know, wow, this is significant. So it's important to have that kind of data and to have people on board and building relationships with people. You know, what we've also learned is we're a little bit surprised at the extent to which the employers are invested in this. I guess that was a little bit of a surprise for us in the end. It was hard, took a lot of time, as Pam said, to sort of get the right people around the table. But once they were there, we have been really pleased with their level of investment in the whole thing. We've also learned that regular communication with community stakeholders is especially important because of the slow-moving nature of the initiative. Things move slowly, so you got to keep, and we're thinking in terms of our community-based trainers in particular, because they're patiently waiting over there for us to be ready to bring in some them and their youth. We have to keep communicating with them and letting them know how things are developing. And also on the nothing about us without us, how to engage, make sure that we're engaging the Indigenous community in all of this is something that we think about all the time. And I think what we're coming down to is that you know, it's not just a matter of creating one Indigenous committee or having one Indigenous consultant or that kind of thing. It's looking for numerous, varied, and ongoing ways to engage the Indigenous community. So we have, I think, 5 Indigenous people on the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council. The United Way also has a group called the Council for Indigenous Relations, which is Indigenous leaders in the community. We've met with that group, I think, 3 times now. Then we have these consultations with the youth groups. We've got an Indigenous person as part of our staff. She's not part of our webinar today, but she's on our staff. We sit right across the cubicle from an Indigenous woman who works for the United Way. And then we have other community partners like the Winnipeg Indigenous Executive Council that's partnering with us on our presentation tomorrow night. So we're thinking that we don't just form one little Indigenous group and call it good. We look for lots of different ways, and we do it on an ongoing basis.
Awesome.
Yeah. So all we've got left is next steps. Pam,
Thank you, Erica. I'm just going to quickly summarize, and then we'll leave this slide up, but we'll move on to question and answering. I just want to make a quick comment about, it looks like you're looking at developing the program holistically, which I think is important. So you're addressing, you know, things like childcare and transportation, I think are super important, that you're considering all these other factors, and you're sort of considering some wraparound supports. So I think that's great. I'm very interested, and I'm pleasantly surprised that you've had 12 employers, HR leads, come together and start talking about strategic Indigenous HR strategy. I've never heard that before, so that is really interesting to me. And yeah, I'm pleasantly surprised. I'm just kind of thinking, I'm like, geez, I wonder if there are businesses in Calgary that would even consider this. And I'm sure there are, but you know, we've never made an intended effort to go that route. So thank you so much. For opening up my eyes, and hopefully the listeners, the wheels are spinning, and hopefully we get some good questions. So I think I've asked all my questions, so I'll just maybe open it up to the listeners right now. Go ahead and start typing your questions in the chat box, and I will read them out loud to Pam and Erica. Okay, Megan has a question. She's one of our organizers. Oh, this is a question from Natasha. How you've talked about engaging business is similar to what living wage organizers are experiencing in engaging private employers to pay a living wage. Yeah, we know what that feels like. The business-to-business championing is especially important. My question is, if you are starting with HR reps before engaging CEOs, are they asking for any particular information or tools to make the case for shifting the HR policies and workplace culture?
Maybe I can speak to that. What we've seen so far is an interest in information on the business case. And we've been able to find a number of different resources and documents from different organizations across Canada that support the business case for a robust and thoughtful strategic Indigenous HR strategy. So we've been able to share some of those documents with them. And so that's one thing. And I think the second thing is what HR leads seem to be appreciating and looking for more of is examples of, and for a while we were calling it best practice or lessons learned. One of our council members suggested maybe it's promising practice. So they're interested in promising practice because organizations or employers at times are very risk averse. They've got a business to run, and so they're willing to be engaged in this, but there's some risk to them. There's risk to potentially their reputation, to the time invested, all of that sort of thing. So the HR leads seem very interested in looking at best practices that they might adopt from other entities or other organizations.
Thank you. So I guess I have a really general question just for you, Pam and Erica. Just your years of living in Winnipeg and your past experience. In your personal opinion, what are the main barriers for Indigenous youth when it comes to finding a job?
Wow.
Erica, what do you want me to?
Okay. Who's starting?
You can.
Okay. I think in Winnipeg, a lot of Indigenous people come into Winnipeg from northern communities where, you know, the education system is vastly underfunded, and health services, all those are vastly underfunded. They come to Winnipeg with the hopes of getting a job, but then they quickly realize it's not so easy. They don't have a lot of experience. Life is different here in the city. It can be very isolating. You know, housing is not easy to find here. So, you know, that transition to the city sets them back. Well, fortunately, we have a few organizations who are working specifically at that transition point. But I think it's very difficult for Indigenous youth to you know, get into the mainstream employment world the same way that other people do. And I think, you know, the Maclean's magazine said that Winnipeg was the most racist city. We don't know. We're not sure if we are or not, but we know that's an issue. And our mayor, fortunately, has, you know, he responded immediately to that claim and said, did not deny it, did not, you know, try and brush it off, but said this is something that we have to work on. And in fact, we have the city of Winnipeg is now hosting an Indigenous Accord that various organizations, mostly educational institutions, Pam? No, actually just a range are signing on to, including the United Way of Winnipeg. So, so there's lots of barriers, but that's what comes to mind for me immediately. Go ahead, Pam.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of those. And one of the things we've talked a lot about, and especially in our conversations with youth, is that when we each think back to our experience of going through the education system, looking for a first job, trying to progress in a career path, we often identify that along the way we had lots of support. We had lots of support, and we had networks. We had mentors. And when we talk to the youth, that's the barriers that they're, or the challenges that they're facing. Often, just as Erica said, struggling with just the basics. They don't have the basics covered, and not to mention no networks. So they don't know where to go to even seek a job. The recruitment processes that are in place are often not familiar to them. You know, they don't have a resume. They've never done an interview. That sort of thing. So it's really some fundamental things that are important to support people in life, but then some other basic things around how do you get a job, how do you maintain one, and how do you progress in a career. So, and this is really more about more than just getting a job. This is really supporting individuals in achieving independence through income, whatever that looks like, and so in a career path. So
yeah, and then,
lots of challenges.
Yeah, and of course we just need to mention the intergenerational trauma as a result of the residential school system and the 60 scoop, and that is really the focus of the learning for the employers right now. So I think it's kind of eye-opening for them to learn about some of that.
Quite emotional. That's one thing we talk about, and maybe that's part of what takes the time. We had the opportunity for many of our, not just our council members, but our employer consortium members to join us in that. We had an Indigenous Insights workshop delivered by one of our council members, actually. And in that, she included a blanket exercise. And when we offered it as a potential a possibility for council members, they embraced it and asked if they could bring others with them. And it was quite an emotional day, as many of you will understand. And so I think just going along that, it becomes a personal journey for so many people. And then they're working to apply it to their work.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about reconciliation. It is so needed on both sides because of that emotional factor, and that it's a shared truth for all of us living in Canada. So it's needed on both sides, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We are going to both get emotional on either side, and we need to take care of that and recognize that. Erica, when you were talking about the barriers, I'd have to say same in Calgary. It's no different in a big city in Alberta. We're dealing with some of the same issues, and it's interesting, we talk about being self-sufficient, but were any of us really self-sufficient? I mean, we all had someone to help us along the way. That's what privilege is. You had those connections, that social capital. Everyone has some of that, so none of us are really self-sufficient. We all have someone helping us along the way, and it's just a matter of finding that someone and making our communities closer and getting to know your neighbors, and that's all part of poverty reduction as well.
For sure. Yeah, one of the things.
Yeah, sorry. Go on. Go ahead.
One of the things we've talked about is once we have the youth in and I connected to the employers, the Indigenous person that works with us, we're looking at that she would head up as sort of a little circle for these youth so that they can get together and talk about how things are going and support each other and that kind of thing. So a little cohort also for the youth once we have them in place.
Nice. Yeah, sharing circles are important for sure. We have a question from Averill. Can you speak a little bit more to the business case and reasons why employers are interested in being involved?
I think one of the first things, as I said, that piqued the employer's interest was the demographics. It really is quite noticeable, the difference in the Indigenous population in Winnipeg with everybody else, and that's who's going to be the workforce in the future, because that's the extent to which the Indigenous population is growing. And so, you know, employers are starting to take note of the fact that that's going to be their customer base in future, so they need to find out if they want it. You know, there's a little bit of self-interest in the whole thing. That it's to their business bottom, it's to the advantage of their business bottom line, really, to engage more employees who are Indigenous. What else can we say about the business case? People have done calculations as to the kind of difference it would make both locally and nationally for our economy and for our tax base if the Indigenous population had the same opportunities for employment as the rest of us. It's quite significant. So in fact, we just came up with there's a couple of papers that have been written on this lately. We did a little blog about the business case, which you could find on our website. But there's also, Pam, do you remember the name of that paper that Dave sent us?
There's one, it's from the Canadian Chambers of Commerce, and it's a document that talks about the importance of business and reconciliation, and it identifies a number of the things Eric was talking about there.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat box. Megan's been posting the blog for everyone to see and the blanket exercise if anyone wants more information on that. I'll give everyone maybe one more second to type in a question, and otherwise I'll just hand it over to Natasha for some closing announcements. All right, Natasha, you can go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lee, Pam, and Erica, for such a wonderful discussion. I hope everybody will join us on Tuesday. We'll be doing the deeper dive discussion, and by all means, we would, welcome you to come and share also what's going on with you, because we haven't heard from everybody on the other end of the line. You know, what has been your experience with engaging your communities to take action on poverty reduction with Indigenous folks? So we'd love to hear, kind of what are your challenges, what are some of the innovative solutions that you're putting into practice as well. So definitely join us then. We will be sending around the RSVP link to that, as well as the recording from today's session, hopefully tomorrow. And by all means, you're also able to share that around with other colleagues if you feel like that they should be brought into this conversation as well. So you can stay in touch with us with Vibrant Communities Canada Cities Reducing Poverty by receiving the latest thinking, news, tools, and resources, by subscribing to the VC bi-monthly newsletter Cities Connect, or you can visit our online learning community for poverty reduction practitioners at www.vibrantcanada.ca. We also have some other upcoming webinars. So if you enjoyed today's webinar, you might be interested in joining us November 2nd. We'll have Cities Reducing Poverty members join us once more to talk about collaboratively developing poverty reduction indicators in rural BC. So representatives from Greater Trail, Nelson, Cranbrook, and Revelstoke, BC have come together to comprise the Columbia Basin Poverty Reduction Working Group. And so this group convenes community collaboratives at various stages of development and implementing poverty reduction plans. So they share resources, learning, and more recently with the support of the Columbia Basin Rural Development Institute, they've identified indicators to help measure poverty with the intention of evaluating the impact of poverty reduction efforts over time. So this webinar will explore effective uses of poverty reduction indicators and highlight the collaborative efforts of rural and remote communities acting on one of the most complex challenges and opportunities of our time. So if you are interested in that, the registration link is there, and I will send that to you in the follow-up email as well. If you are interested in community engagement, on the next slide there, we have a 3-day in-person event coming up in Kitchener, Ontario. And so this event will convene community change practitioners, and we'll explore the next generation of community change principles and practices. You'll learn about interactive techniques and technology for engagement, theoretical frameworks for engagement, movement building and systems change, the latest in interviewing, facilitation and dialogue techniques, and lots more. We convened this workshop earlier in March in Vancouver, and we're hosting it again on this side, or on the east side of the country, because there's been so many people asking for it. So that registration link will be sent in the follow-up as well. And I think on the next slide we'll just see in a few days that you'll receive the follow-up email that I had mentioned with the PowerPoint slides, the recording, the links to the COP call. And you can email me, natasha@tamarackcommunity.ca, to provide your feedback about today's webinar, because we're always trying to improve on our experience. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.